Hello. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about font rendering. In other words, dropping text into frames or working with text in this vector space for laser display or for other purposes. All right, so when you get LaserBoy, it comes with this in the ILD folder. If you go right here, this is the LaserBoy folder. If you go into the ILD folder, you find there's a folder called fonts, and this comes with a distribution. And inside this folder, there's a whole bunch of font files listed. And you'll see they're ILD files, right? But they are, in fact, these are font files. This is how the LaserBoy font rendering system works. And by the way, I might want to point out, this is LaserBoy version, this would be October 6th of 2020. And this is the first tutorial with this new version of LaserBoy, and a few things have changed a little bit from the previous tutorials. One of them is in the tab menu. I added this H rendered variable font space, and I'll tell you what that is when we get to it. So that means all of these other options here have been pushed down one in the alphabet from previous tutorials that you saw before this one. Okay? And also in the X menu from main, I added this option 7, bond words in editor font rendering, which means that all of these options have been pushed down either one digit or one letter in the alphabet. So menus are, I didn't take anything out, I just added a couple things. Okay, so I wanted to make note of that. So we are running the October 6, 2020 version. Okay, now back to the font files. This is what comes with LaserBoy, and these are in fact ILDA files. So we'll just go ahead and open one. In one for ILDA, 3 to change directory, go into fonts, hit enter, and let's open Arial and replace the current frame set, and boom, there it is. Okay, now you'll see, okay, this is the 0th frame. And the last frame is the 93rd frame. That means there's 94 frames in this font set. And it's the entire set of visible glyphs in the standard Ascii character set. And they are in the same order as they appear in the standard Ascii character set. As a matter of fact, that's how LaserBoy determines which glyph to use when it's rendering font into vector space. It basically, when you type in text, a string of text for LaserBoy to render, or you read that text information from a file, which we'll get to a little bit later, each character that's entered has an associated ASCII numerical lookup value, and then LaserBoy uses that value to find the frame number, right, to determine which glyph to render. All right. Now, something that I had to kind of invent here to make this work was, as you've seen in a lot of my previous videos, LaserBoy can find individual lit segments and then move them, scale them, rotate them, independently of each other. So this, you'll notice, here's a lit segment, and here's a lit segment, and then this whole thing is a lit segment. So there's actually appears to be 3 lit segments here, but I'll show you what's really going on. I'm going to go into the tab menu, and I'm going to choose option R, display background grayscale. So it's going to set the RGB values to be the same, so it'll give me some shade of gray from black to white. Okay, and this is option R now. It used to be option Q, but we just changed the menu, right? So I'm going to say R, and let's say 64. Okay, so now we have this kind of below mid-tone, kind of darkish gray, and we're not going to save that. Okay, now you see this? You see this line right here is black, all right? And you'll see there's one there, and there's one there, okay? Because normally this would be a lit segment, and then this would be a lit segment, and they would be separated by blanking. But in this case, this is lit black. So this vector right here that appears to be black is actually marked as lit. It's lit black. So that bonds these two elements together into one segment. As a matter of fact, every frame in this frame set, every glyph, is in fact one segment. You can see it right here. It's one segment. Okay, so here's a good example right here of why you would want to do that. Okay, this is a double stroke font. This is actually derived from the TrueType font, which a TrueType font is in fact described in vector, but it's for displaying, it's for rendering on a raster computer screen, or it's for printing on a printer. And the way an operating system or a printer would handle this information is it would say, okay, here's these two vector shapes, these, you know, the inside and the outside here, and then it would flood fill this space in between with a solid color. So this vector line doesn't really appear, it just acts as a boundary for when this gets filled with a solid color. And you can scale these vector fonts. That's the whole point of TrueType fonts, is you can make them any size you want to, and they always look good because they render nice smooth curves and lines, and they look great. As opposed to a bitmap font. See, this is a bitmap font. This is literally made out of pixels in rows and columns. Each one of these characters occupies an 8 by 8 pixel grid or square space, and then the pixels are either turned on or turned off, and that's what gives you each character in the character set. So we're not concerned with bitmap fonts. I just wanted to point out there's two different kinds of fonts. There's a bitmap font, which is what this is, and then there's raster font, which is actually, or excuse me, there's vector font, which is actually defined as vectors, which is what this is, okay? Now, I'll show you. If I go into, well, all right, I don't want to get ahead of myself. All right, I've already told you about this bit right here, this lit black business, and you see that you've got a whole directory full of font files here. So let's see what we can do with them, all right? I'm going to escape out. What? No, I'm not. I'm going to hit 9 to go to the first frame in the set. I'm going to hit M in order to render by coordinates. Let's pick a nice bright color. We'll go with yellow, 255, 255, 0. And we're going to render a monospaced font. And what this means is monospaced font means that every character is placed on the baseline at an equal distance from each other. So each character takes up the same amount of space along the line. And here, now it's asking me, oh, wait a minute, escape out of here and go shift and hit the tilde. All right, now we've got a blank frame. Now we hit Q, and it's asking me to describe a baseline. Now, it's going to ask me for 2 points, and it's only going to ask me for the X and Y values of those points, because it just renders font right onto Z equals 0 plane. And you can move it around later if you want to, but that's where it puts it by default. So this baseline that it's asking me for, the default value is it's going to start at negative 30,000x, which is all the way over on this side of the frame. Okay, so we'll go with that. That's saying Y is 0, which is right along the middle of this. It goes right through the origin of space, right? Y is this way, of course, and it's 0, which is about midway. Well, it is exactly midway. And then it's saying positive 30,000, which is all the way over here. And again, it's saying Y equals 0. That defines a perfectly straight horizontal line right through the center of this frame. And now it's asking me, what font do I want to use? So let's go ahead and use the Arial font. All right, and now it wants me to render text. So just for this experiment, I'll just show you what's going on here. This is a line of text, and there it is. All right? It just rendered this, okay? Now, this is a monospaced font, which means every one of these characters takes up the same amount of space across this line, okay? And that space is determined by F, rendered mono font field space, which is currently 70%, okay? Now, remember when I was showing you what a font looks like? We'll just go back here, and we'll go in, whoops, we'll go in, one, stay in the fonts, open Arial again so we can see it, replace the current frame set. Okay, now Arial is open. Now I'll show you this. If I go to the user interface visuals, I hit C to turn on the floating axes, escape. You see, this now defines a quadrant or 1/4 of the space here, which I mean, we're looking at it as two-dimensional, right? I mean, it is actually three-dimensional, but the font itself, as you can see, is two-dimensional. See, it's sitting right there on the Z-plane, and it's completely two-dimensional. So go back to here, back to normal. Okay, now this quadrant of space right here is the font character field. This is 100% of the space that defines where each character in the font set exists. And you'll see in some cases there are what you would call descenders, which means, see, there's a good example. There are things that go below the baseline, but this right here is the baseline, and this is used when you render the font. It renders on this as the baseline. This is where it's actually rendering from, this point. And the stride of the font, or this spacing between the characters of a font when you type it in, is going to be based on a percentage of the width of this square, of this quadrant. So back to my example, I'm going to hit 9 to go to the first frame. I'm going to hit M to go into the render where I can render things by coordinates. Shift, hit the tilde. We got a blank screen again. Okay, let's get rid of floating axes. Right, so back to here. So in the tab menu, like I said, rendered mono font field space, it's currently set to 70%. So if I make that something like 100%, you can see if I go Q, we'll go Arial, boom. Okay, now each one of these characters is taking up 100% of the space of the quadrant in which it is defined. Even though, I mean, it's scaled down, it's smaller, obviously, so that the whole line of text fits here, but the glyph size is determined by the size of the quadrant of space that the character occupies, where it's actually defined in the font file over here, all of these. Okay, so as you can see, we can change this. We'll go back to here and we'll change F to 200%. And no, and we'll pick a different color. All right, and we'll say Q. We'll go with the same X value, but I want to put it above the one, so we'll go positive 7,000. And we'll stick with Arial. Boom. And you can see they're spaced, the gaps between them is considerably more than this, because they're actually, each glyph now is taking up twice the width of that square. So they're spaced quite a bit apart from each other. And you can do just the opposite of that as well. You can say, let's see, rendered font, we'll go with 66%, which is 2/3 of the square. And we'll pick a different color. Go with magenta. All right. And we'll say Q -7,000. Drop it below the midline. Right. Font name Arial. Boom. And you can see now they're much closer together, right? But again, this is still a monospaced font. In other words, every one of these characters is spaced at exactly the same interval. And by the way, this gap right here, the actual space that you get when you hit the space key or the space bar, is also the same width as the placement of each one of the visible characters that's here. Okay. So that kind of describes things as far as a monospaced font is concerned, and that's the things that you can do with that. I kind of showed you how it gets rendered and how that works. So now we'll go. All right, we'll go M. Give me a new frame. Okay. Now another kind of font rendering is variable space font, and what that means is a variable space font. Each character in the font is placed based upon the width of each individual character. All right. If you go in the tab menu, you have rendered variable font gap, which is currently set to 20%, and you have rendered variable font space, which is set to 50%. Again, this is relative to the size of the square where each glyph in the font is defined. So when I render, I'll show you, I hit R to render variable space. Just go with the default line there. Wide vector is a good choice. Go with that, and right, boom. Okay, now you can see this I is much narrower than this capital T, so the spacing these things are spaced accordingly. And again, you can see, let's get out of here. Let's go ahead and make that. So what is it? All right. All right. You can see the capital or the lowercase L is very narrow. It's only like, it's basically one point wide, right? So it's the 20% that's referred to right here in this rendered variable font gap describes this gap right here from one letter to the next. Because this is a variable space font, it's placing each of the characters based upon its width, right? So you got to be able to control the gaps between them, okay? And so if we go to tab and we say we have no gap at all, we'll set this to 0, G to 0. Now it's 0, right? And we'll pick another color. Yellow. Right. And we go, wait a minute. All right, we go R for variable space, and baseline we'll go with 7,000, which puts it above what we've already rendered. Wide vector, we'll stick with that. All right, and all right, so now you can see we set the gap to 0, so now you can see there really is no gap between them. See, these are touching, and right, these would be touching, but this thing right here has a little bit of width to it, which is what you see here, right? Right, same as this. See, this is actually touching the L because there's 0 gap there, okay? So this is a way that you can kind of control what you might call kerning, which is how the font lines up, particularly with a variable space font like this. You can also set it to something considerably more than 20%, say G, You can make it 100% of the width of that quadrant of space. And we'll pick a different color, like that. And we'll go R, and boom, and negative 7,000. And boom, and yep, Y vector is good. Okay. Boom. See? It's all the same font. It's just a matter of how you're spacing it. And it's still variable spaced. It's kind of harder to tell because most of the space that between them, the way that they're placed along this line, most of the space is being controlled by the gap between them rather than the width of each character. Okay? So there's that. Yeah. You can also, okay, see this right here is a space. See, I hit the space bar in order to get that space there. So because a variable space font is placed along the line based upon the width of each character, well, a space has no width because there is no character associated with it. It's simply a gap, right, from here to here, right? So you have to be able to designate the width of a space without actually having anything to go by because a space has no width. So right now it's set to 50% of the width of that quadrant of space, the square, 50% of that. So we can change that, H, we can change it to only like 20%, right? And we can change the rendered variable font gap, G, to like 20%, and make it something less than that. Make it 12%, okay? So now, when we go to render, pick a different color. Let's go with red. All right, there's red. We go R, and we go Y. 14,000. And we'll stick with the wide vector. Boom. See? Oops, I hit a capital H. Well, whatever. You can see now that proportionally, you see, the spaces between the words is a little bit packed more than it is in these other lines because we are able to control the width of the invisible space, right? Okay, now, another thing that we can do that's kind of cool, we're going to go over Shift tilde, so we got a nice blank frame there. Okay, so I'm going to set these to something that's more reasonable, like what they were. Let's see, rendered monoface font. Okay, let's see. F, we'll set this back to 70%. G, we'll set this back to 20%. H, we'll set this back to 50%, so we are at our default values now. All right, and new. Okay, now if we go from main, right? This is main, right? We're going to menu X, and see now we have a new option here. That is 7 bond words in editor font rendering. Now, what that means is if I render a font like, let's see, we'll do a fixed width font, and we'll go Courier New, which is like the typewriter font. Yeah. Boom. Okay, we get that, right? Okay, now, if I go into either menu K or L, let's go into L, right? If I tap, see how it selects each glyph individually. Now, interestingly enough, this glyph right here, if we move it up so you can see it, all right? See, it's got just that, and it's got the whole glyph. In other words, it has both the inside and the outside of the O, because as I mentioned before, they are stuck together with lit black, right? That's the whole point of that, right? So you can do some kind of interesting stuff because you can get to the individual characters as a whole concept. It's one segment, one lit segment. So LaserBoy can find the individual pieces of this line of text, right? Now, another thing that I could do, if, like I said, if I go into menu X and I turn this on, bond words in editor font rendering. So I'm going to hit 7, turn that on, escape out of here. No, I don't want to save it. Go back to menu M, hit the tilde, get a new frame, empty, go make a different color. I'm hitting the P key, by the way, and Shift P to move it backwards. There's yellow. Go again with Q. Baseline is fine, right? And yeah, Courier's okay. We'll go with Courier again. Okay, there's 5 words, right? Boom, all right? All right, there's 5 words separated by a space. Now, because we said we want to bond the words together, now when I go into menu L, it selects whole words instead of individual characters within the words. So again, you can manipulate them, you can pick them out from the rest, and you can manipulate them as individual lit segments or objects, right? Just like that. See? That's how it works. That's the whole point of lit black. And also, you know, taking this whole lit black concept a little bit further, okay, if you go into menu H, you can see you have some options here. From menu H, you can convert black to blank or blank to black. But, of course, it applies to the entire frame. So, if I hit black to blank, which is B, there, you'll notice, whoops, let's go, okay. Now, you see the blanking, and if I go into menu L, when I go to bounce around the individual lit segments, see, it's finding literally the individual lit segments, like this, in this E, for example, you see, it's no longer glued together as one single glyph because we converted lit black to blank, okay? Conversely, if we go back into menu H, we can do just the opposite of that. We can hit blank to black, which is option C. All right. Now, this whole thing has become one segment. This whole thing, if I go into menu L, tap the U key, the whole thing is selected because the whole thing is one segment and it's glued together. All these individual elements are glued together with lit black. So you have some control over things that when if you're trying to build elements and those elements involve multiple lit segments, you can glue them together. You can bond them into one lit segment with black in it in place of blank, right? So that's kind of useful, and it applies to a lot of different things when you do frame effects or something. Like if I were to, okay, we'll just go ahead and fix this so I can, whoops, menu L, right, and we go. Oh yeah, hang on a second. Escape H. We're gonna go. Wait a minute. Let's just do this. Let's go menu M. Let's go back to. We'll go back to give me a blank frame. All right, we're gonna stick with yellow. That's fine. Q, good. Baseline's fine. Let's go. Yeah, Courier's okay. And all right, so we're back to here again, and go to menu L, and see, we got whole bonded words because we didn't turn that off. It's still on, so our words are still bonded as whole single lit segments. So now, if I go to N and I apply an effect to this frame, and I want to, move things around, I can say this, do the spin effect, for example, and there. See? Now they stick together as whole words, right? That's kind of the whole point of the lit black concept, right? That's what it's about. So you can do this kind of thing, okay? Right. So I think we've pretty much covered what these things do. The rendered mono font field space, that's the spacing of a fixed width or font, right? And then there's rendered variable font gap, is the gap in between the characters when a font is rendered based upon the width of each character in the font. And then there's the rendered variable font space, which we have to define because a space has no width to go by. So you have to literally define it, which is what we do there. And then the other thing that we looked at was in menu X, whether or not to bond words together. Because if you don't bond words, you do get you get bonded characters, right? But you don't get bonded words unless you turn this on. So, all right. So now that kind of covers a little bit of, the fonts, where you find them, what's available to you. Also, I should point out there are some that are single stroke fonts. I think we looked at that, and I made the wide vector, the narrow vector, and the laser ellipse font specifically for LaserBoy for the purpose of being able to render a nice looking font that is rather conservative when it comes to scanning. It doesn't you can get through it about as quickly as of anything, of any kind of font, because you don't have to, like, to do a capital O, you don't have to strike it twice. You just go around it one time. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So if I go menu M and I go to, let's change, menu M, change the color to something nice like magenta, and we're going to, we'll go with variable font, and baseline, and negative, right, and go with laser ellipse, and boom, and there it is. That's laser ellipse. And that's variable spaced. And if you don't want to see, there. Now you can't see the vertices or the blanking path. That's what it looks like. Okay. Now, a completely different way to manage and render font is with a plain ASCII text file. And it looks like this. All right? Now this also comes with LaserBoy, and it's right, hang on a second. All right, here in the main LaserBoy folder, inside of the text folder, this is where text files go that you would open into LaserBoy in order to render things. There's a thing called text.txt, and this is that file when you open it. And any line that begins with a hashtag is a comment, which means LaserBoy just skips it, doesn't read it. So all of this is just for your information, and it describes how a plain ASCII text file gets rendered into LaserBoy when you open it, right? And you can read through all of this. And there's an example of every form that LaserBoy does. So let's go ahead and get this going. I'll open it for you, which it actually takes a minute because there's a lot to render, right? And replace it's going to take a minute. So let's get back to what we're looking at here. Okay, it shows you that these are all of the available. This is the entire glyph set right here. These are the named fonts that are available. And then it describes these are the actual instructions or keywords that have to appear in the text file that makes this format work. And like I said, it takes a while. See, it's still working on rendering it. But we'll go back and forth. I can show you what each one of these things does. The first thing that gets rendered is, see, this says text still frames 20. So that means that in all of the font forms that only render one and only one frame, it's going to make 20 copies of that frame. And the reason is because when you want to make an animation or something, you want it to appear on the screen for like 20 frames in the animation. That's what this is all about. That's what this number does for you. It's still rendering. It's almost done. There's a lot to do here. And you can see the first thing that it should render is right here. It says text still frames 20, and then it says text fixed line. This renders a single, there it is right there. This renders a single line of text. And it says here, this is the first, see this right here? This is the first single line of text. And as you can see, there it is, right? And you can go through the whole file of what gets rendered. Some of them are, in fact, animated, like this one, for example. This is the marquee effect, or form, whatever you want to call it. And every one of them, as I mentioned to you before, you know, there's fixed width font placement and there's variable width font placement. And this format here, if you read this carefully, it allows you to do every form as either the fixed font spacing or variable font spacing. So anyway, that's the whole thing. And there it is. And I would encourage you to read through this file. Oops. Should I encourage you to read through this file? Now you can see it. Yeah, the whole thing is here, and I would encourage you to read through this whole thing because it describes all of the keywords, if you will, in this format and how you use them. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email, or, you know, find me on Facebook, or, you know, call me on the phone or whatever. So, all right, I guess that kind of wraps up this tutorial. I think we covered quite a bit.